setting up a YouTube live stream because we had 130 people register, and Zoom is only going to allow 100. So in case we go over that mark, we'll just have that ready for them to move over to YouTube instead.
Oh, wow. Are people in breakout rooms already? Or these are?
Yeah, so they're in breakout rooms right now.
Okay.
But once we get this live stream set up, then we can assign everybody else to those breakout rooms as well.
Got it. Okay, cool.
Yeah. How are you doing?
Good. How about you?
Good. Good.
You're all set up. It's streaming away. You don't have to do anything.
I think we're solving for X, asking for how far down the spring presses. So that's going to be at X value. And then the other side is FDH. I think that's all we need.
All right. Cool. So yeah, Mike, if you want to make me host again, then I can manage the breakout rooms.
The deflection, so what it says, the deflection is most nearly, I believe that is the spring. The deflection in the spring. Oh. Because the spring is the KX squared, so that's the compression. Right. Deflection is spring. And then the right-hand side equals FDH. Right. That's deflection is good now. And we want to know how much it compresses the spring. We're ignoring that deflection because we're not talking about beams. Well, I think the deflection is the X in this case. Okay. Because in beams, it would be different. It would be different. Yeah, it just goes away. I just don't know why.
Okay.
All right, Mike. Well, I think I'm going to. Are you planning on sitting in for this, or do you need to hop off to the other webinars?
Another one.
Okay.
So I'm trying to figure out one thing. I'm just looking at the live stream while. Okay, good. It's working well. All right. I will be here.
Mike, well, I think I'm going to. Are you planning on? Is that the delay for the live stream?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just feel it. Okay. Good luck.
Thanks.
All right. See you later.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Breakout room 3.
Make sure you're muted.
Right, I'm muted.
Joel, can you hear me okay?
See what happens here. This doesn't seem to be working.
Joel, can you hear me okay?
Hey, Aaron.
Hey, Joel.
Hey,
How's it going?
good. I got steered to a breakout room, and then I haven't navigated breakout rooms virtually before, so
Okay.
I decided to come back to the main session.
All right. Well, there should have been other folks in the breakout room.
Yeah, there were a couple people talking, but I was trying to figure out some of the technology here and didn't was busy with that, so I just muted myself while I was exploring
Okay.
whatever this platform is. Zoom. Okay, we're in Zoom today. Nice beard, man.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, let's see.
I haven't touched
I
it
could-
or trimmed it since end of May. This is definitely the longest it's ever been.
All right, there you go. So yeah, here you can look at me now.
Yeah, right back at you.
Yeah, sitting in the kitchen, we're having a little dinner, and all that. And yeah, I'm sorry I forgot to pre-register. Thanks for sending me the thing. So you haven't trimmed the beard. I haven't actually had a haircut. So what you see right now is a tied back thing, and here I'll show it off.
Nice.
There's
Little
the
ponytail action.
pigtail. Yeah, yeah, just a little bit of that. Yeah, so
Right on.
we can all yeah, enjoy this however we are. I don't know.
Right. Do the things that we normally wouldn't do when we see people face to face almost every day.
Well, I used to could. I had a ponytail when I was in maybe graduate school. It was in the 80s, something like that. So, had more hair. It was, more, I don't know what. It just
Right.
was. These things happen. So, no big deal, right? We can, my thing with that is, as long as I'm not like putting spikes in my head or something like that, it all, you know how that goes. It's all, you can do whatever you want. It grows back. It's cuttable, whichever way you want to look at it.
Right. Cool. How are things going?
Good. Is there things are good. Yeah. Is there a way to sort of see who's all listening to our inane conversation right now?
Yeah. So besides you and I, there are 3 other people who are muted themselves and are not too active.
Right. Okay.
Eric Rivera, Anthony Hardman, and Mohammed. Pretty much everybody else are in. We got about 16 or so that are in the breakout rooms.
Okay. How many breakout rooms are there?
There are 4 total breakout rooms.
Okay. 4. Wow. So somebody, all right. That's cool. And then is it possible to see the names of everybody that's joined on the call? Or is that only you can see that?
So at the bottom, if you see participants.
Yeah, I see 5. So that's
Right,
just
okay.
us.
That's just the participants that are in the main room right now. So once I close all those breakout rooms in about 5 minutes, then you'll see the full list.
I see. Okay, so oh, I see. And there's a breakout rooms thing here. And oh, I've been assigned to breakout room 3. I see. So I could go back there and yak with folks.
Yep.
Okay. So you did some assigning there. Was I supposed to be like leading breakout room 3 or something like that, or?
No, it's kind of to mimic the social networking stuff we do beforehand in in-person meetings. So you can have your little huddles or smaller groups that all chat with each other before the presentation starts.
Okay. Cool. And then, is it possible to access some other breakout room or just breakout room 3 is it?
Yeah, I can assign you to a different breakout room.
It's not absolutely necessary. I was just wondering, but it's something that you would have to assign, and because I'm happy to just socialize. Yeah, but you actually have the master control. You can see who's where and all this sort of thing.
Right. I've got the host responsibilities.
Cool. So yeah, okay, cool. Well, so let's see. So another couple minutes here, And yeah, well, how are things with you?
Pretty good. Yeah, the whole Big Ladder crew has been working from home full time since middle of March.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you guys still have the office if you need it?
Yeah, so we still have the office space. Yeah, I think unfortunately we had just renewed our lease like October last year. So I don't know what Peter has tried to do in terms of negotiating some kind of a forgiveness or I don't know, something because we're not using it. I mean, he goes in once every week or two just to make sure that nothing's burned down, you know, but
Right.
other than that, we've all kind of like taken our monitors or other hardware stuff and made home offices from that. But yeah, just getting by on all the web meeting platforms, Zoom here and GoToMeeting and Google Meet and just like
Right.
yeah.
MS Teams, Blue Jeans. Boy, there's more of these than I thought there were.
Right.
As soon as I get up to speed on one, we have to shift to another. So,
Right.
so it goes. It's okay. But at least, it's just like any other platform, right? At least if you know what to look for, then you got a shot at finding it. So,
Right.
and now but yeah, I guess for some reason, this feels like a different flavor of Zoom. Have they modified it recently, or are there different flavors of Zoom?
So Mike Wilson at IBPSA-USA says that Zoom has gone through like a bunch of changes, like minor updates and tweaks almost every month. So they might have some, different, I don't know, buttons or features or something, or maybe their specific account settings would be different than a private account. Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. And then let's see, what else is on the agenda? I guess the next meeting in November is that finalized with the student meeting?
No, I don't think so. I believe that as things stand, Paulo at least responded and said that students would be interested in participating. I don't remember off the top of my head if Wangda replied as well.
I thought I saw a reply from Wangda positively, but maybe I'm imagining it.
Right.
I guess we can pursue all this with Tim after tonight.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and actually Mike was, before everybody came in, he was wondering if it'd be possible for the different IBPSA-USA chapters to try and give him a some kind of a lead time for what topics they want to discuss. Because he is trying to get more sponsors involved. So having more than like a month ahead of time of notice in order to have sponsors say, hey, I'm interested in that content or that topic or whatever. So I told him that normally we have these meetings in like December, January, somewhere in there, and we kind of plan out what we would like to do. And he's like, that's fine. As long as it's like a tentative, maybe in April, we'll do this topic kind of level. He's not looking for a specific speaker name or anything that's really nailed down solid.
Yeah, actually, yeah, this year, I mean, ASHRAE is virtual again this year too, so we could, well, we'll have to see what the ASHRAE schedule looks like. Here comes like everybody.
Yep.
They're back.
Well, he kicked us out of the breakout rooms, so. Hey, Aaron. Hey, Joel.
I'll give you 60 seconds. Plenty of time to wrap up your conversations, you know?
Oh, there's Kamel. All right. Hey, Kamel.
Hey, Joel.
Yeah, how you doing? Yeah. Yeah.
Good, we ran into each other here. With there is no ASHRAE, so it's good to run into each other here.
Right. Yeah, and on a few other of the 140 things and this and that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely good.
The topic looked interesting for the presentation tonight. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. RMI. Yeah. So we'll get some of their perspective.
Yeah, exactly. The 140 stuff, it's moving along nicely, I guess, huh? The 140 ECB, it's a tough one.
That's
the wording, you know, is pretty tough to.
Right, all that. It's not a light lift, but I think when it's done, it'll definitely make a contribution. So
Absolutely, yeah.
So, but it's, you know, it's just like a lot of these things. The devil's in the details, and the details have to be dealt with. You know.
And we have the 140, which was the test cases were meant more for engines and to make them work within 90.1. You know, a bit of effort, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. It's the classic thing of an engines test versus an applications test, where an applications test is you know, harder to diagnose differences, a little more noisy, and or maybe a lot more noisy, and that's, you know, that's a thing with that. So you know, and that's what we've avoided at noise as best we can.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, we've had some really good discussions. Those conference calls.
But anyway, we should probably let the agenda take control of itself. Sorry, Aaron.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sounds good.
All right, so welcome back, everybody. Again, we've got our presentation from two folks from Rocky Mountain Institute, Philip Kuhn and Raghu Sunam. So Philip and Raghu, whoever's going to be controlling the screen, should be able to share your screen for the presentations. And in the meantime, we've got about 20 participants that are on the webinar right now. So what I'll do is I'll allow you to unmute yourselves and raise a question during the presentation. If you wanted to ask that, otherwise you can hold your questions until the end. And then we'll also have some polls along the way to keep everybody engaged, and watch out for those. Raghu, I think. There you go.
Yeah, sorry. Can I just let you know when to initiate the polls, Aaron?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll start sharing my screen. If you guys can let me know when you can see it.
Yep. You see your screen?
Perfect. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Raghu Sanam. I am a manager on the portfolio energy optimization team with RMI. And then I'll be speaking with Phil. Phil, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name's Phil Kuhn. I'm a principal at RMI and lead the portfolio energy optimization initiative. And we'll kind of split the presentation with Raghu.
Yeah, I'm more of a recent addition to the team. So Phil has been working on it for quite some time. So he will take over the first part of the presentation, where he'll be speaking more about the overall vision for what PEO framework or tool, if you may call, is about. And then we thought it would be a good idea to sort of like just start talking about a case study, how all the high-level visions were applied and how the whole thing was implemented for a project in Canada, National Capital Region. And then I'll go over the high-level approach of what the PEO tool takes. So can you initiate the first poll, Aaron? So the idea is we're just trying to just understand like what all of you guys feel about the biggest hurdle is in terms of retrofitting projects, because that's the key focus.
All right, so we have about half of the folks who responded to the poll. Okay, leave it open for a few more seconds here.
Looks like we're gonna have a clear winner though.
It looks like it. All right. Cool. Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to end the poll here. I'm going to share these results. Yeah, so it looks like the clear winner is the lack of motivation to retrofit from the owner's perspective, the first option.
I think that would be a great segue into Phil start talking about the vision and how we think through PEO we're able to sort of motivate the owners more and sort of like undertaking such a retrofit study.
Right. Okay.
Great. Yeah, and I think before I dive into these slides, I just wanted to kind of say that, we're presenting this to kind of give you an idea of what we've been up to, but also, would love to get feedback on kind of what seems like it would and wouldn't work, and anything that, I think we see this as kind of a platform where we can add, modules that add additional functionality to what we're doing. So any ideas on that front, very open to advice on how to proceed. So just wanted to kind of open that up as something we can talk about. So before diving into portfolio energy optimization, just wanted to share a couple of slides about Rocky Mountain Institute for anyone that's not aware, but we're a nonprofit organization, been around for about 35 years, is co-founded by Amory Lovins up in Old Snowmass, Colorado. The Institute's been growing pretty rapidly, especially over the last 5 years, have over 240 full-time staff now, 4 locations in the United States, as well as an office in Beijing. Not on this slide, but there's also a partner organization in India as well. On the budget side, I think one thing to highlight is we're going to be presenting a project that is more on the consulting side. RMI does that type of work, but that's really about 20% of revenue. 80% of the funding for RMI comes from donations. So we're very much a mission-driven organization. Could we jump to the next slide, Raghu? So this slide is really just giving a visual overview of the different topics that RMI is focused on. You can see it's a pretty broad spectrum spanning the overall energy system. So, we have buildings, but we also are looking at transportation, electricity, industry. The portfolio energy optimization initiative is inside the buildings group, and we're really focused on commercial buildings and renovating existing buildings. So I'm going to do a few slides on just some context and why we're approaching it the way that we are, and then I'll dive into a case study of a project we recently completed. So on the challenge side, we're very focused on the issue of climate change. So that really leads us towards carbon emissions coming from buildings. So a few facts, I'm sure many people here are very aware of this, but buildings are the #1 contributor to greenhouse gas emissions globally, as well as air pollution related premature deaths. They emit 14 gigatons of carbon emissions annually. That breaks down to about 3.5 direct being the fossil fuel burned in the buildings for space heating, water heating, things like that. 6 gigatons from indirect, so that's primarily from the electricity that they consume. a gigaton from refrigerants and the leakage associated with them, and 3.5 gigatons from embodied energy related to construction and renovation. And the one that I find most startling is really to maintain a 1.5 degree future requires just a dramatic increase in retrofits relative to what we're seeing today. So from reviewing the studies, we're seeing that a 50% reduction in building related emissions is required by 2030, so in just 10 years. So that's really what's driving our work, is using energy modeling, but doing that to influence building owners to scale these retrofits in a dramatic way. Could you jump to the next slide? So the question is, why are they not doing that? Which kind of goes back to the polling question. And I think that lack of motivation, I would definitely agree with that. There is an interesting study that, or not a study, but a survey that is conducted by the Institute of Building Efficiency called the Energy Efficiency Indicator Survey. They send it out about once a year. It's sent globally to facility and sustainability leaders. And one of the kind of clusters of questions is really around barriers associated with investment in energy projects. And this slide shows kind of a high level of those results. One thing I think that's interesting is you can really kind of cluster those, and a lot of them are really around just reliably identifying financially viable projects. And so that's really another key focus for us, is how do you do that, and do that in a way that you really engage building owners en masse. This next slide gets a little bit away from the scope of the discussion tonight, but I think it's worth sharing because it gives some context, because it really influences some of the decisions that we're making on the way that we are developing the tool that we have. So we really see kind of 4 big components that have a potential to influence the market. So go back. So the first one is the idea of zero carbon buildings is really needed to reach that 1.5 degree future. The second one is zero over time. The third one is mass customized analytics. And the fourth one is a marketplace. I'll dig into each one of those a little bit more. So the idea of zero carbon buildings is just really making sure that we're driving building owners, motivating building owners to retrofit their buildings in a way that actually achieves the goals associated with that 1.5 degree future. And focusing on energy may or may not do that. It really needs to be focused on carbon, which leads to electrification, and then also grid-friendly buildings, so that the electric utility is able to actually get a deeper penetration of renewables, and then efficiency. But I think efficiency in this context is different than at least I used to think about it, which is efficiency helps with the grid-friendly aspects because it flattens out the curve, and it also makes the zero carbon bundles more cost effective. But efficiency for efficiency's sake is maybe less important than it was in like a previous paradigm. Zero over time, one thing we're finding is electrifying buildings is not necessarily cost effective in all areas at the moment. And so pairing that with the concept of zero over time can be very powerful. So zero over time is really just a very pragmatic approach to retrofitting a building, where you're pairing the retrofit with investments that need to be made in that building already. So the boiler has reached the end of its useful life, a tenant leaves, and you're going to have to renovate that space. Timing the renovations with that allows you to go to more of an incremental cost with your financials, which improves the financials pretty dramatically. The mass customized analytics is what we're going to talk about most after I move off of this slide. And that's really about how do we get detailed analytics for a large number of buildings in a consistent way that is fast enough and cheap enough for the market to adopt. And then finally, the marketplace. We're hoping this is that really starts to answer the question that was highlighted in the poll, which is motivating building owners to act. And so the intent here would be do the mass customized analytics, but pair it with a marketplace that allows people to buy things at a lower price than they would be able to otherwise, because they're aggregating them together and buying them in bulk. So we are seeing there being a very interesting combination between an energy simulation tool and a marketplace that would be supported by that tool. Okay, so I'm going to go through this case study and then we'll pause and we can have some discussion if anyone has any questions. So the Canada NCR study is a study that was commissioned by the Canadian federal government for their national capital region, which would be Ottawa and Gatineau, would be the Canadian equivalent of Washington, D.C. They commissioned a zero carbon by 2050 roadmap. And we partnered with an organization called Sustainability Solutions Group that has been creating plans like that for multiple governments in Canada, but they had never really done a deep dive into the buildings themselves. So we came on and we did the building analytics for the study. And we're presenting this now. The report will actually be published by the government. We're hoping in the next couple of weeks. So this is pretty timely. I think it will be more public, and there'll be a lot more detail available in just a couple of weeks on the overall plan. So the focus was really on the buildings owned or leased by the government, not the entire city, but that still accounted for about 60 million square feet of properties. We did not directly model all 60 million square feet. We did model 30 million square feet, and that included 162 of the buildings, which were definitely the ones that were the larger ones driving a lot of the emissions. So kind of showing that a little bit more, you can see here a small percentage of very large buildings dominated the emissions, and that's why we ended up focusing on those 162. We also made sure that we modeled multiple of the smaller buildings so that we could use those to extrapolate the modeled results to the higher quantity of smaller buildings that had less of an impact. Could you go back for 1 second? So the graph on the left is showing kind of all the different areas that the government was interested in including in their plan. That included buildings, the district cooling and heating systems, employee commuting, the vehicle fleet, landfill, water treatment, wastewater treatment, and water supply. You can see that the buildings and the district heating and cooling supplying those buildings was the dominant part of the carbon emissions. So that's about 60%. The only other area that really competed with that was the employee commuting, obviously important, but not in as direct control of the government as the buildings. So this slide just shows a few photos of the buildings that we did model. I think the largest one was right around 2.5 million square feet. So some of these are very large, complicated buildings. Some of them did look like castles. Some of them, we did look at the Parliament building. We looked at the Prime Minister's home. So it's a pretty broad spectrum, both in size and system type. So we looked at multiple central plant types and 12 different HVAC system distribution types. So a lot of variation across the portfolio. So we were looking to get to zero carbon, and so heat pumps were a huge part of the solution in this case. Probably not a huge surprise there. I think it was specifically a big deal for the NCR region because the electricity there is so clean. It's primarily from hydro and nuclear. So by shifting to electricity, we're able to cut a lot of the emissions out of the building. Hopefully that's kind of like looking in a fast forward view to the United States though, as the electric grid gets cleaner here as well. And one thing I think was a big takeaway for us was just how much energy savings is really not a good proxy for carbon emissions reductions. You can see here, the first two columns are carbon emissions. The orange and the gray are probably not that important. That's more of a nuance, but the orange ones are before we apply HVAC solutions, and the gray is the entire retrofit bundle. You can see that carbon emissions we were able to cut by 87%, but energy was only 29%. So big difference between the two. This next slide is just a screen capture from the report that will be published soon, showing some examples of the measures that we evaluated. This is one page of 9 that we looked at. Obviously, not every solution was appropriate for every building. There's kind of a matching process that was required. So something like this will give you some examples of kind of these system level interventions that we were looking at, such as a central heat pump tied to a ground source loop, water source heat pumps tied to dedicated outside air system, and like a central boiler cooling tower combination, things like that. And then I think the next slide is similar. It's another example from the report. This one is showing just 7 buildings and a summary of the results of each building out of the 162 that we modeled. The one thing I want to highlight here, which we've seen in all of the pilots that we've done, is how much the appropriate bundle per building changes. So even though these buildings are all in the same climate and generally the same location, the set of solutions per building actually changed pretty dramatically per building. And I think that's one of the key reasons that we think our tool has the potential for a lot of impact is finding a standardized solution for all buildings doesn't really seem to be viable, but finding a standardized process that moves quickly to find a customized solution does seem to be viable. And then finally, this is just the different scenarios that came out at a portfolio level. So this shows 4 investment scenarios moving towards like a zero carbon scenario for the National Capital Region. You can see that it's aggregated for the whole portfolio. Each building is modeled individually, but then aggregated. But we're also doing that over a timeline. So the investment in each building is kind of tied to that zero over time concept, where each building, we're looking at the age of like the boiler and the windows and other things, and triggering investments in the appropriate year to maximize the financial viability. But when you blend that all together, you kind of still get this consistent downward slope. And I think, Raghu, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's the last slide on the case study. So this might be a good time to pause just to see if anyone has any questions or discussion around that.
Sure. So I know I dropped this in the chat for everybody, but feel free to raise questions either in the chat or unmute yourself and ask it using audio. So any questions so far?
Yeah, fair enough. Just wanted to give everyone the opportunity. Raghu, I'll hand it over to you and you can kind of dig into the details of the approach.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Phil. So will be talking more about the details of how. So I think Phil covered how this whole approach of PEO was applied in the Canadian project. I think as energy modeler and also like as most of the IBPSA crowd is, it'll be interesting to sort of get into like what happens under the hood of the tool to sort of see what the why we try to go through this. Before I sort of get into more detail, I guess I just want to get an idea of like how I think a lot of folks from the Denver area, I believe, work a lot on scripting and using templates to automating the process modeling. Just wanted to get a feel of the makeup of the audience. I don't know if you can maybe start the second poll.
Sure thing. Okay, so poll number 2 was just launched. So give folks about a minute or so to respond to that. All right, we're at about 70% of folks who have voted. And we've got 2 clear favorites.
Yeah, it looks like you're good to dive into the details is what I'm seeing.
Right. Okay, give it about 10 more seconds. All right, cool. So I'm going to share the results here. So it looks like the clear options are the first 2, either regularly working with energy modeling software and using scripting, which is 70% of folks, or regularly working with energy modeling software but not using scripting, which is the remaining 30. So luckily we don't have anybody who's totally new to energy modeling software. So sounds like Raghu, you can really get into the details here. Yep. Uh-oh. Did we lose Raghu?
Did we lose Raghu? If you don't mind, we could give him 1 second to rejoin. If not, I could carry on with the slides as well.
Sure thing. I guess while we're waiting, Philip, is there any indication of future projects using PEO that are maybe on the same scale or larger scale or complexity or anything like that coming down the pipeline?
So currently we're working on a couple of projects with NREL and the Better Buildings Alliance that are focused on grid interactive solutions. So I think that's what we're focused on currently. I'm really hoping to focus on building this marketplace on top of the analytics. I think it has the potential to really change the value proposition for building owners. So I think that's what we'll be looking towards next. For a big like zero carbon study, we do not have another one of those lined up right now.
Right. Cool.
Sorry about that. I got kicked out by my Wi-Fi. I hope I'm sharing my screen again. Hope you can see.
Yep. Yeah, we can see your slides. Yeah, and I've got the poll results up. It's about 70% are using energy modeling software with scripting and 30% using energy modeling software without scripting.
Awesome. So I guess clearly, I think majority of the audience understands the power of like scripting. And I just before I sort of set the start talking about the tool, I just thought it'd be helpful. So I'll get into like how we plan on implementing this, how we are implementing it as a tool. And one of the main agendas for RMI is basically for the PO team is to essentially get to RMI's decarbonization goals, and scaling the whole solutions in a really quick way. And as Phil talked about it, I think addressing the commercial buildings is one of the most impactful ways that we've identified. So retrofitting buildings, to enable that, we have chosen the software solution, developing a software solution. But we do understand that outside of the whole realm of tool development, there's this whole project process that we need to be aware of. And so we've identified like the 4 major phases of the retrofit projects where we think we can sort of have technological solutions. This particular presentation, we will be focusing mostly on phase 1, which is developing remotely developing a portfolio energy models, and then prioritizing projects about where to invest, where to make investments. And then there's a bit of, I'll speak a little bit about the on-site validation, which we think would be helpful in sort of fine-tuning the results and making ensuring there's more confidence in the results from this analysis. The marketplace that Phil was talking about, where we sort of want to bring in a technological solution for the owners to sort of then, have an easier way of identifying market solution. That's something that's in the pipeline at RMI. But in this presentation, I'll be primarily focusing on phase 1. So just give an overview of the framework of the tool and how the workflow goes. And folks who work with scripting probably all understand this. But the first step in the PO tool is essentially just creating what we call as a baseline portfolio performance using energy models. In this context, what we mean by baseline is essentially the current existing simulating the current performance of the whole portfolio. So we generally gather information from the project owners, the portfolio owners, and the facilities team, gather enough information about all the loads in the systems. We categorize the inputs that are needed to get the models up and running into 2 categories: mandatory variables, which are more about like what kind of systems are needed, what are the use types of buildings. That's something that we really need. Then there's some assumptions that can be made, where we call them fine-tuning variables, where if you don't have like really detailed information about a specific lighting fixture, we make some assumptions and just get the models running. And then we go through the iteration of fine-tuning the models and making sure that the baseline performance aligns as much as possible with the actual performance, and by comparing it to the metadata. And so this is the first big chunk of the work that PO tool does, which is just developing all of these models. So we use the model kit templates and scripting to basically populate a ton of models that need to be built for the entire portfolio. So for example, NCR project, we're talking about like 162 buildings, where we don't want to spend weeks together on populating so many different energy models. So we have an input CSV file, which we basically populate, and that then basically runs all of these 162 models. So then the second part of the whole workflow, PO's workflow, focuses more on analysis and the investment solutions and bundling of different solutions. So for us to be able to get to the point of this analysis, the huge portion of the effort on this side involves just market research, just trying to understand what kind of energy conservation measure solutions are available out there. Oftentimes when we do in energy modeling analysis through traditional processes for retrofits, there's this gap between the analyzed solutions to what's actually available in the market, like the solutions that are available in the market. So we start from the market in terms of like getting a hold of all the market based solutions. And then based on the first cost, based on the impact they would have on reduction of site carbon emissions and also source carbon emissions, we then create different permutations and combinations of these ECM bundles. Once we have all of these bundles ready, for each of these ECM, there are specific modeling attributes that we identify where we're then able to sort of gather the specific required attributes from the market solutions, which are then repopulated into the baseline model. So essentially, we're running the models again with these specific ECM bundles, and then that basically the results from these runs then are used to make these investment plans for the owners, which we can then which I'll be talking a little bit more in detail, but essentially we come up with specific plans about where it makes more sense for project teams to make investments. A big part of PEO's focus has been enabling automation. We use several platforms to basically do different tasks within the tool. The primary core of the simulation engine that the PEO platform uses is Energy Plus, but at the same time we use a model kit from Big Ladder. Then we use Ruby for like automated data transfer. We also do like visualization of the results through just like Python scripting. And we also work with Microsoft to sort of just do the economic analysis portion of it. The whole emphasis that we want to have is automating the whole the workflow, because that we believe would help us in scaling this solution in a much quicker and a much cheaper way, so that we are then able to motivate owners to invest in retrofits. I'll be speaking about the rest of the presentation. I'll be speaking about like what are the major highlights of PEO and why we think we are sort of like getting to contribute to project teams when we start using such a tool. The first one I think we want to talk about is we really believe in analyzing all potential investment options. In traditional approaches, there's often the limitation of time and resources in analyzing all possible solutions, and that's something that we were able to get over just because we were able to automate a lot of this analysis. And when we say investment strategies, there's the kind of detail, like this is one of the examples that I have on the slide, is there's different categories of investment strategies that we have we researched in terms of like just improving the efficiency of the systems, improving the flexibility of how the systems work to sort of work with demand response techniques. And then there's also this whole thing about like generation, it having solar PV or other renewables integrated. In this one particular example that I have, like the capital efficiency projects, the investment strategies involve all the way from replacing of HVAC systems to sort of like changing of the lighting fixtures and changing of lamp fixtures. So as you can see, there's a like really high level solutions that we talk about, but then when we start modeling it, we need to be very specific. And so each of these investment strategies that we've listed, there's this huge amount of research that was done about like what solutions are available in market and what are the financial feasibility of actually implementing them. So this is another example of like a deep dive of like what we mean by mass customized investment strategies. In this particular example, I'm talking about what I mean by changing the lighting fixtures. It's a simple enough ECM that we talk about, but we often don't look at when we replace a lighting fixture. There's this whole impact on changing of the lumen level within the space. So we want to make sure that the lighting solutions that we are providing are not only more energy efficient, but at the same time also meeting the requirements of the space. And so it needs to be customized based on the needs of each and every specific project, rather than just giving a single investment strategy for the whole portfolio.
Can I jump in real quick on that one?
Yeah, sure.
I think one other thing is like just the specificity of the solution has so much to do with the financial results of that solution, which I think everyone knows that, but like we're trying to build that directly into the tool and automate it. So like a LED tube may have a much better ROI than a fixture, but the fixture may have an integrated sensor package that allows us to do daylighting control, occupancy, demand response, and can we use all those additional functions to get much deeper savings and improve the ROI to the point where it's competitive to that tube. So those are the type of things that we're trying to evaluate.
Yeah, and the other highlight that I think when we start talking about the financial analysis, it's very important to understand how the financial analysis changes when we start talking about individual buildings and when we start talking about like large portfolios. In this particular study that was done before the Canada project, where we were looking at commercial stores. So there were 2 stores that were studied in Texas and in San Diego. And so traditionally, most of like financial studies, the decision-making criteria depends mostly on the first cost and also like the NPV, but without getting a nuanced understanding of the actual utility tariffs and the utility and the incentives that are available at each of these specific stores, this sort of like detailed information that we were able to pull from these different locations completely changed the way we would make the investment decision in this particular case. Like although in the first go, without looking at the specific utility tariff, if we were to look at the solution using just like a general average tariff, it seemed like it made better sense to be investing in the Texas store. But when we started looking at more nuanced detail of the utility tariffs and then also the specific incentives that were available in California, I think it was like the San Diego store had like 7.5 times more investment potential that was identified. And this sort of ends up becoming like a big factor for at a portfolio level when we start doing these sort of very specific mass customized studies at each level, at each store. And there's also the scales of economies of scale that we can take advantage of as we start talking about like larger portfolios. There's this huge advantage that portfolios at a portfolio level that owners are able to sort of like leverage. So in this particular case, there were different stores that were aggregate like the spread across the country, but then aggregating the findings into an overarching portfolio sort of helped identify a very specific prioritization order in which the owner could sort of make. And I guess most modelers would sort of agree with why it is important to start looking at very specific data. It's one of the reasons why we think doing a mass customized approach instead of doing like a high level benchmarking study is more appropriate, is because portfolio analysis sort of like data light processes like that could lead to misleading results. And then there were some studies that we've done with one of the previous projects where it was the way the recommendations were made completely changed when we started looking at like very specific data. So we want to emphasize on how important it is to sort of like look at quantitative studies, and that's one of the reasons why mass customized study like ours we think is more valuable. And another big part of what the advantage we want to sort of like get out of this whole using a PO is to sort of like just foster like a big level, like at a high level, like what if you're able to sort of foster electrification, which we think is very important for us to get to the decarbonization goals in general, and to sort of also sort of foster grid interactive solutions. A big part of which is being able to manage and limit the peak demands. When we start looking at very individual buildings, it may seem like just reducing the demand is enough. But when we start looking at portfolios, there's a lot of nuance that we can sort of start looking at. In this particular graph, as you can see, the two lines that you see are how the peak demand varies before implementing the measures and after implementing measures. And as you can see, the peak electricity demand shifted significantly from the summer afternoons for the baseline simulations towards the winter morning warm up when we actually implemented all the measures. So this sort of shift in peak would have a huge impact on the overall grid, how the grid would be functioning. And so just having.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Raghu. I just wanted to clarify that this graph, the previous graph was a single building. This graph is the hourly demand profile of all the buildings in that Canada project. So you're getting into pretty significant demand territory, like 60 megawatts. So it really does start to speak to a different audience. It starts to say, you know, if the federal government actually electrifies all their buildings, this is how it's going to affect the electric grid.
Yeah, I think a big part of electrification is also understanding how the source emissions works. And this graph that you see is the data that we received from wartime. I think one big part about electrification is the hope that the entire grid moves towards renewable sources of energy. And when we start moving towards renewable sources, it's really important to understand how the demand profile changes and how to be able to capture how the demand profile looks during the whole thing, and managing that time of day of when electricity peak demand occurs, I think is really critical. And that's one of the nuanced results that we are able to sort of look at through the PEO. And then looking at so this is sort of like a snapshot of what the detailed results look like. So the different levels of detail in which the results can be viewed. So we basically use the same sort of outputs to be speaking to the building engineers to start to speak about specific solutions that can be invested in each of the locations. But at the same time, because of the kind of high-level financial results that we're able to sort of present, there's also the same study results can also be presented to at a high-level CFO. And once funding is available, project-specific economic results to develop deployment of these strategies and to sort of mobilize vendors, that sort of takes place as we sort of go on. And this is basically visualizing that whole entire table that we were looking at. As you can see, the net investment strategies, it greatly varies from different locations. So in this particular graph, each bar that you're seeing is a different location for the portfolio, and how the different categories of investments, how much they would have impact, what the net impact of each of these categories of investments are in different locations. As you can see, it greatly varies from one store to another. But essentially, but when we're able to visualize all of these data, when we're able to collect the results from these mass customized models, which we are more confident about, we are then able to sort of make a better decision about where the owner should be investing more money to be able to get to the required and the desired performance goals. I think that's basically just giving a highlights of what we work with and how we sort of use the outputs from the PEO tool. And happy to sort of answer any questions. I think you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Raghu and Philip. That was a great presentation. Yeah, we'll open the floor to folks to unmute themselves if they want to ask a question or if they want to type it in the chat and start having a discussion.
Here,
I have one question. Thanks for the presentation, Kamal Haddad here. And did you look at the order in which you implement the ECMs and the impact of the order in which they are implemented in a building?
We do. Yeah, we didn't touch on that a lot, but we definitely do that. So there's kind of two things that we're looking at that dictate the order that the investments are placed. The first one is going back to that 0 over time concept, where we're asking about the attributes of the building, but we're also looking at the age and condition of major systems. And that is kind of allowing us to say, okay, well, roughly speaking, the business as usual case is going to replace the chiller in 5 years, the boiler in 10 years, the windows in 15 years, whatever. But then the second part of ordering things comes back down to kind of doing things in the right order relative to reducing load before you install HVAC so that you can reduce the capacity of that equipment. There are trade-offs between those two. I can't say that we've fully automated that, but that is the way that we're trying to optimize between those two competing things. We didn't talk about it a lot, but the Microsoft component to what we're doing is kind of a financial analytics that goes through all these models and does a bunch of different financial calculations. And it also looks at the capacity of the equipment in each simulation and adjust the cost of that equipment accordingly. So if we're able to reduce the size of equipment because we improve the envelope, or say if we put in chilled water storage or ice storage, all of those things would get reflected in a reduction of cost of the HVAC equipment.
Okay, interesting, thanks.
Thanks for the great presentation. One quick question. Are the baseline model calibrated to all buildings? Because I think you mentioned there were 100 over. Or is it just the delta, the savings that you guys are looking at when you do the subsequent simulations?
Yeah, that's and Raghu, you can chime in here too. That one's a bit of a tricky one for us. We've had a lot of conversations. I feel like I've talked to people with pretty mixed opinions on calibration. I will say, so where we've landed to date, and I'm very open to finding ways to improve this part of our tool if there are recommendations. My big concern is blindly using the computer to make the model match historic energy use, with the idea being if we accidentally change the wrong variables, we may influence the results of the measures in a way that we're not intending to do. So maybe to be a little bit more specific about that, I think a lot of times the energy model and the actual building's energy use do not match because of retro-commissioning type solutions. And if we were to change things like infiltration of the building or a schedule, that we don't know that was the problem, it actually changes the financials of, say, if we replace the chiller, it may actually make that chiller look much more attractive, when in reality, we should have just turned some things off at night. So we try to we try to isolate those two from each other, where before we do a major capital investment, we've kind of got back down to what we would call like a perfect operation of the building. So we truly are evaluating that capital expenditure and not a bunch of operational improvements.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of a convoluted response, but that's why we take a kind of a stage gate approach to it where we're trying to tackle those problems.
Yeah, and I think a big part of how we try to sort of talk about when we say calibration, we want to be a little careful, and we essentially want to focus on making sure that we're confident with the inputs, with the models, and making sure that we are not modeling hypothetical scenarios, as Phil was talking about. And so that's where the on-site validation of inputs comes into play. We try to sort of make sure that the outputs from the model more or less look similar to what we're seeing in terms of the consumption data that we get from the buildings, and we try to match as much as possible, but we don't want to be modeling hypothetical scenarios in terms of modeling. So that we try to be a little careful. So I guess we can probably say it's calibration light in a way, not really going all the way.
Yeah, I think one thing, what we're trying to do is we try to collect some very specific asset data about the building, like what type of HVAC systems are in there, you know, what is the control strategies that are used in that building. And we treat those as kind of stakes in the ground that we can't manipulate once we know what those are. And then we tune the models based on things that are less known and that we think would be maybe more operational. But again, we then kind of remove that operation and isolate it from the capital expenditures.
Yeah, and this is one area, as Phil was saying, we would love to hear if any of your teams are working on and have like come up with like great solutions. We would love to hear more about any great solutions in this area, but for now we've been trying to keep it light.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. I think that makes total sense to me actually. And when I mentioned calibration, I don't mean we treat it as like a machine learning black box or something and just make the curves match. My thoughts are more like fixing the parameters that you guys already know based on your audits or based on the info that you have, and just probably just calibrate in a statistical manner the rest, the unknowns that perhaps you guys do not yet know, the unknown parameters. And then another question is more your range of savings, what's the sensitivity analysis on it, as in what's the variance and the range does it usually go to, or is it really just a more deterministic number based on your recommendations? I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but.
Yeah, well, I think so. I can take a stab at it and let me know if I'm going down the right road, but we are delving into sensitivity analysis. We have run sensitivity analysis for several of our projects. And I think there's a huge amount of power there, right? Because we can start to use the tool to tell us what the most important inputs are in the first place. And that starts to streamline the data collection process. And because if you think about it, like an office building in California may have different data needs than a hotel in Chicago. So I think sensitivity in that area is something we're very interested in. I think on the output side, we've been addressing it more from a set of investment scenario options more than a true statistical output. I will say one thing that we are trying to balance is the models get pretty complicated. So we use Big Ladder's model kit. We've kind of created our own version of that. Still working very closely with Big Ladder, but the results of all the templates and scripts can be some pretty complicated energy models. For that Canada project, we had models that took 4.5 hours to run for a single iteration, which is not unusual for energy modeling, but when you start talking about modeling hundreds of buildings at a time, and then you start thinking about doing statistical analysis using those models, the computing starts to become pretty intense. So that's another part that we're looking to try to balance.
Yeah, and I think the sensitivity analysis from the financial side, that's one area we're definitely looking to improve, and the marketplace, which we're talking about, which would essentially be like a platform for owners to procure the market solutions, like a sort of an open market for all of these market solutions. I think that we would end up having a lot more control over that sort of sensitivity in terms of pricing when we start when we're able to pull it all into one platform.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, hey, I had a question. I mean, I see like the opportunity on mass scale simulation, but the zone-based model, if it's off by that much in the summer peak loads, and you're making recommendations on the mechanical, but it's probably going to be off. I just feel like it's a little bit fuzzy. Like how have you calibrated the geometry impact from the zone-based model to the actual calibrated model? Because I think the shape has a lot to do with it too. So
could you clarify what you mean by zone-based model? I just want to make sure I'm following your question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not sure exactly how you're, I guess, generating the geometry, but I mean, there's existing data sets which are just shapes. And then, there's zone-based, which is kind of like subdivided in like an algorithmic way, but it's still just kind of northeast, southwest. It's not like, shape by shape. So, and then there's space-based modeling. So like at some point, you're probably going from zone-based to space-based. And have you looked at kind of like the impacts on that, like on geometry, or is that how you're doing it? I'm not sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Raghu.
I'll just start this solution, and I think Phil can answer this a lot better. I think geometry is one of the areas which most modelers struggle a lot when we start talking about like quantity in terms of scaling up in terms of numbers. Essentially, the way the PEO platform, we do the geometry modeling is we broke down the information required to model a geometry into different parameters in terms of in terms of floors, and when we start talking about a floor plan based on how the geometry shape looks, we break it down into something called stacks in the geometry. And so there's a bunch of parameters. There's this huge number. There's about, I don't know how many, few thousand parameters that the team has sort of like put together. It is much more extensive in terms of collecting rather than just creating a high level geometry. So it's so there's a lot more detail, nuance in terms of the geometry that is modeled, and that's why we start talking about like mass customization instead of creating just shapes. Phil, if you want to add to that.
No, yeah, it is a good question. So it's an area where so we do go, we get measurements of all the exterior walls, all the windows, all the doors, and those are placed in the model. So it knows that there's so much surface area pointing south and north, and how much windows are in that orientation. So we're doing that. On the zoning side, we do take a simplification in the sense that we do not draw the floor plans of the buildings. We break that up in more of a distribution format. So if we say there's 80% office, it's going to equally distribute that. We do have some parameters that allow us to bias that in one direction, but I would say that's one of our key simplifications for accelerating the model. At the moment, we have been talking to some organizations that use LiDAR and other things to automatically build those floor plans, but we haven't went down that route yet. We have compared a more detailed floor plan based model to the approach we're taking, and the percent difference has not been that great, but it's somewhat anecdotal. I wouldn't say we've done a proper study of a huge range of options there.
Cool. Well, I mean, yeah, there's definitely a lot of ways to approach it, but when you're kind of proposing, expensive HVAC, it's kind of, it could be anywhere really, because I mean, our cold climate, warm climate, and sometimes it's kind of like refining it right down to point that works for the data set, but works for the application.
So are you arguing like the zoning is necessary to do a projection on if you should invest in a certain HVAC system? Is it the zoning?
Well, it's just like if you're making a proposal for an HVAC, but I mean the zone-based analysis, if it's not specific enough, then it's not making the predictions in the right way sometimes.
I think that's totally true. I would argue,
like you're saying, like most of the time it won't affect it, which is good to hear, but if it does, then it's kind of the geometry isn't refined enough to get to the right result.
Yeah, I guess I feel pretty comfortable that we're capturing the geometry. I think the zoning, I could see that to a certain extent. We do have multiple layouts, like we can do perimeter core floor by floor, we can do zone specific HVAC, we can do floor by floor HVAC. I would also argue that there is a laundry list of other things that you need to define about an HVAC system that have just as much impact as the load profile to that system. So, obviously the performance curves, but also like a whole laundry list of control strategies associated with that: supply air temperature, static pressure curves, things like that. All have just as much influence as that. Which doesn't directly answer your question, I know, but I think like really focusing on all of those holistically is what we've been really focused on doing.
Yeah, and I think one of the key areas where we're trying to sort of get towards is to increase the confidence in which we are able to do mass study for portfolios. So moving from a data light approach, which involves benchmarking, to sort of like getting into more nuanced modeling. There is obviously, as I guess, no energy model can be as perfectly accurate, but how confident are we to use those results is basically what we think we should be focusing on. But you're right. I think that's one area it's constantly changing the way we are approaching how we're doing the zoning and the way the parameters that we're using to sort of define the zones and the geometry. I'm sure the approach would be significantly different in like a few months down the line, but at this point we seem pretty confident, as Phil was saying, with what we're saying.
You can also think of this exercise in a similar way to a schematic design for building. So you're doing a high-level analysis of a portfolio, and when the time comes to implement it, then you end up working in a building, and you can further refine your assumptions when you are actually implementing something.
That's another way in which we can refine the solutions. We would like to think this whole analysis to be an iterative process where we're able to sort of fine-tune the inputs as the more time we spend on the more detail we want to get into each of these analyses. It's not always practically possible for us to be constantly iterating every single thing, because there's going to be some parameters which we would not be able to get even if we are on site. But geometry, I guess you're right, it's one area where it can be iterated and improved, made more accurate once we've identified a certain building as like a deep retrofit candidate. That's like another way in which I guess we can fine tune.
Yeah, over time, when a decision is made to proceed with the investments, then you can refine your decisions, yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing we've seen is like how much of the decision ends up being on the financial analytics side, especially when you're thinking about retrofitting existing buildings. So like it's a little different, I think, in new construction where like everything's on the table. Where with existing buildings, there are multiple options, but a lot of times the existing conditions start to narrow that list pretty quickly. So like for instance, we looked at big box retail stores and it's like, well, it'd be really like we could do some really cool stuff if we put a central system in here. Then you start looking at the first cost associated with all the distribution associated with that compared to just a premium performance rooftop heat pump. And it like the decisions, like there's just the decisions obvious from the financial side. We see that a fair amount too. So like you end up narrowing the solution set quite a bit on the financial side.
Yeah, so it's much more obvious in many cases, yeah. Okay.
Hi, I have a question. Just wondering on that slide where you had the different tool or software vendors and stuff. You have Blueprint and Epiphany and Genability. Could you kind of speak a bit more around those? Like you have that asset data structuring. Is that using something specific like Building Sync, or is that sort of dedicated for this PEO back software implementation? Thanks.
Yeah, that's so one of our next steps is we do want to align to Building Sync and Beads. I can't say that we've done that yet, but it is on the to-do list. Blueprint. So Blueprint and Epiphany have both been efforts to kind of move us. So I guess one thing we didn't really mention is this is still very much a kind of internal RMI tool. We run it off of a command prompt regularly in the like code text files, and we want to move that to a more robust web-based platform. So Blueprint is an organization out of the University of California, Berkeley, that's in their computer science department, and we worked with them to develop a dynamic questionnaire that had some attributes to it that we thought would be more powerful to collect the amount of information we need, because we're aiming to collect enough information from building owners in a remote way for a whole portfolio of models. So it's a pretty big request from the building owners, and the work with Blueprint was to streamline that. Epiphany is a computer software developer out of Italy, and we've been working with them to develop a European web-based version of this. And Genability, we've mainly been working with them to pull from their database, which is a pretty deep database of detailed utility rate structures, which is something we put a really high priority on, which is we don't use like a blended utility rate. If there's a ratchet or a block or a time of day demand rate, all that's built into the model. And then a lot of our grid interactive solutions, we're really aiming to get them to look at that price structure and adapt accordingly using EMS logic.
Cool, that makes sense. Thanks.
All right, any other questions from folks? All right, well, I did have one question myself. Raghu, on almost your last slide showing the different bar charts for cities and locations and what their kind of economic costs are, it seems like there's a really big potential for those first two columns on the left for, what was that, San Francisco and San Jose, to be making an impact through PEO tool. But was there anything that seemed like there was a key reason why those two cities are driving or resulting in such big economic savings?
Phil, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sorry, I'm talking a lot more than you, but this was kind of
That's
before
fine.
you. So this graph is showing results from, we evaluated all the stores that REI, the outdoor co-op, has across the country. And so that's what you're looking at here is big box retail stores. And so a lot of that is the utility rates and the incentive structures that were available in California. I'd say those are by far the two biggest drivers. I think the far left column in San Francisco also had some unique existing conditions. It was an older building, but a lot of it, the taller columns you see on the left are heavily influenced due to utility rates and also advantageous lease structures. So some of the stores that don't have a lot of investable projects are because they're leased properties and REI didn't actually get the cost benefit from investing in them.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it kind of looks like in San Francisco, that huge blue bar for HVAC makes it look like it was some system installed in the 60s or 70s that hasn't been touched.
Yeah, that was
the
definitely
RES
an anomaly.
store in SF is in this really, really old warehouse store in Soma. So that makes complete sense.
Right. Yeah, but then across the board for all these cities, lighting seems to be the driving part of each package.
Yeah, and a lot of that is the lease structure thing and who actually is responsible for those rooftop units. But what's interesting is some of the stores across the portfolio really got hardly anything in the package, like maybe some LED tubes, and that's about it. But overall, the portfolio, we identified 39% potential energy savings. And a lot of that's about just funneling the money to the stores that can really get a good return on that investment. So it's one of those things where talked to a lot of portfolios over the last few years, and they're really looking for kind of a standardized plan where they can just say, hey, aim for this target. And these results would suggest that's really not the way you should go about it.
Sure. Cool, thanks.
Yeah, and let me just say I really
consider,
appreciate the invitation.
Did you consider like weather morphed files for this?
What's that?
Scenario? Did you consider future scenarios, like future weather?
For REI, we haven't, but we have started looking at that. Yeah, and the initiative we're in hasn't looked at it, but we do have another group that spent a lot of time working with New York State and are developing cost curves for a lot of these technologies. And we haven't built that in yet, but I think that really goes to the scenario thing, because I think it has a lot to do with the building owner's trust and like what they're willing to accept for future projections. But I would love to start building that in as well.
Yeah, I think there's two aspects in which we can start looking at future outlook. Was just the weather files itself and what we use for the simulations. I guess it's like we would need to start looking at that. But yeah, I think that's one area where we will be great to sort of start incorporating that future outlook.
It gets a little tricky.
Multiplier.
What's that?
You could put a simple multiplier on the file, or you can spec one out, but it's just future morphing, like future. It'll just be hotter and hotter, but it doesn't matter.
I'm drawing a blank. We found a couple of companies that sell future weather files that we were looking into, and we've tested, but we haven't used in a project yet. I think one thing, if anyone has thoughts, we'd love to hear is it seems like it gets a little challenging if we're trying to develop an investment model that spans multiple decades and we're placing investments kind of on that timeline, that means you can't just really run one weather file. Like you kind of need to iterate from present day until, through that timeline. which just adds even more complexity. And I wouldn't say we've got a great solution for that yet.
Yeah. Well, it's going to increase like summertime peak load.
Definitely.
So,
yeah.
So whatever is going to like, hit the money on that, then, has a bigger opportunity of getting like specified.
Yeah, I would agree. The other interesting thing we're seeing is, well, we've been working a fair amount in northern climates, as you've seen probably in this presentation, but electrifying shifts the peak demand to winter morning in northern climates. And so that the weather file kind of actually dampens that a little bit potentially. So in either case, I think it's interesting to look at, no matter what the dynamics end up being.
Yeah. It's like a curveball.
Yeah. It's a lot of moving pieces, that's for sure.
Yeah. Cool, thanks.
The aim, though, is to make sure that in future the difference is not too much, and I guess that's what we're working towards.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, if there are no other questions from the attendees, then I'd like to say thank you again to our presenters, Raghu and Philip. This is very enlightening and good discussion for everybody. And if you're an IBPSA-USA member, you should see a recording from this within the next week or so, posted on their website. And I think that's all for me.
Thanks again for the invitation. And there are emails for both Raghu and myself at the bottom of the presentation. So if you have any other thoughts or ways that we might be able to work together, just please reach out. We're all ears.
Yeah, thanks for having us, and we would love to hear if you guys are working in the same areas. We'd love to hear how different solutions that come up.
Sounds good.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Bye.